So, hey everyone, welcome to the SIG Network Policy API Upstream Kubernetes meeting. It's the 6th of June, 2023. Let's all follow the Kubernetes Code of Conduct and be nice to each other. Let's get started with the thin agenda that we have for today. But before I go on with the agenda, are there newcomers in the participants today in the team meeting who would like to introduce themselves? I guess not. So let's go with the agenda. And so there are some PRs that are up for review on the repo. And I think Yang was working the other day, earlier this week, on trying to install the admin network policy and baseline admin network policy APIs in his cluster to work with Antria. And he ran into some issues and he wanted to come up with some documentation that can help users get started easily on the process of installing the CRD on the cluster. And now that we have a released version of the API, our first release, which is the 0.1.0, it should be easy for people to just get it from the raw GitHub actions thing, and then just do a kubectl apply, and that should work. And I think this is the installation for that. And I think there's a nice developer preview of how this looks like under the guides on getting started. So if any of you are interested in doing reviews, it's kind of an easy one. And I think this is nice to give it some thoughts. I've left some comments and I think Yang will get to them. So that's the first PR. Then I think the second one was something that I added. I was trying to get the implementation in OVN Kubernetes for the admin network policy, and I noticed that we have support for status in ANP, which we didn't have in network policies. But I think the status is the meta-weave and conditions, so it's not really standardized in any way, and the implementations have the freedom to choose what kind of status they want to set, which makes sense with whatever their logic is for implementing the policies. But I thought it would be nice for us to also print that in the OC get output command for both baseline and admin, so that users can leverage back from the status without having to do like a full describe of the policy. So it's also a very small and neat change. So if anyone wants to take a look at it, we can get that in before the next release.
What does it do if there are like multiple statuses or multiple conditions?
Yeah, I think it would print the first one because let me go back to it. Because it does the star thing, and I've seen that usually with respect to other CRDs, what I've observed is usually picks the first one, but that's a great question. I think I should double check. Let me put a comment here. Any questions on that one before we move on? Okay, if not, I've been working on the conformance tests still. I think what I'm going to do next is, so there's been a lot of PRs that are floating around with the new tests, but just to ensure that we are on track in real, like these tests are kind of helpful for other implementations also. I'm kind of waiting on Yang to give initial feedback on the existing tests that we already merged, and to see if those are also helpful for Antria and not just for OVN Kubernetes, so that we have some kind of an agreement on the framework before adding more of them. But I think the one thing that I would really try to get in is the baseline admin network policy conformance, which is just basic tests, at least so that I can then leverage that for my implementation downstream. But I'm trying to kind of hold off on adding newer tests till we have at least some initial feedback from the Andrea folks also on what they think about it. And then I think I'm also going to add some documentation for conformance tests so that other contributors can also know the general framework and how to move around with the code and what kind of tests already exist today and what more tests we need to add in the future. And out of the issues that we had, let's see. If anyone is looking for help around contributions and how they can get involved, I think if you click on the area conformance label, there are a bunch of things that I've opened that I could use help with, or even the community could use help with, and we can iterate over there. If anyone wants to volunteer to pick these issues, that would be great. Especially with this one. We have a Poke server utility that we use for the tests, which basically does an end-to-end checking, right? Is the connection reachable or not with the existing policy in place? And I think we can really improve the parser because it was just the first version of the iteration. So if there are volunteers and if you have cycles, please do take a look at this one. I'll link it to the chat. Any questions on tests, conformance before we move on? Okay, take that as a no. And I actually added this item for admin network policy, especially with logging it, but around debugging in general, right? I don't know how other implementations are doing around this. Like for network policies, at least in OpenShift, and in OVNK, we have a specific annotation that we do for namespace. I'm not sure how other plugins handle this. Do any of you know? And is this something that should be more of an upstream option that we should provide, or is it something that's very implementation specific?
I can't provide. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Oh no, go ahead. I was going to provide some context from the GKE side, but you can.
Oh, I think that would be better first.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, on GKE, we have network policy logging as well, and yeah, we support either a annotation on a namespace, or we have our own CRD, which you can just use to flip it on cluster wide. So you can choose either turn it on for the whole cluster or opt in individual namespaces.
Yeah, I wanted to just discuss it in general because when you, so first of all, developers and like namespace owners, they will be able to see which admin network policies exist in the cluster, right?
So question, oh, I turn on the camera, that's not what I want. So if you do logging, which is great, will you also look at specify sort of Prometheus counters and stuff like that and different sort of metering?
Do you mean in downstream implementations? There is no way to do that in
No,
general,
yeah,
right?
yeah, sort of expectations.
Yeah, so like different plugins may have different abilities here. And so I guess we'll definitely want to look at what different people are doing on their own for network policies and see if we think it makes sense to try and have a standardized way of saying it in admin network policy. Or we may have like a standard way of requesting logging, but with no standard definition of how the
Yeah,
plugin implements it.
yeah, I just wanted to understand, but I mean, it matches with what I thought.
Yeah, no, that wasn't really a response to you even. That
Yeah.
was sort of a in
No,
general.
no, it's like I have sort of, it's hard to log when you don't own the implementation, right?
So the question for ANP would be who can enable this logging, right? Because
Mhm.
if you're a namespace owner and something is dropped by admin network policy and not by your local network policy, you probably may want to know that, like to debug. But then,
No, yeah, no.
yeah, they
If it would only be usable by the admin.
yeah, but well, that makes sense. But then also how namespace owners will be able to see which network policy drops their packets, let's say.
I don't think the namespace owners will have that insight if the drop is caused by an admin network policy, right? They will have that insight only if the drop is caused by the network policy on their namespace.
Yeah, but that's gonna make debugging somewhat more difficult, maybe.
Do users of the cluster usually, do they have rights to debug the cluster? I thought it was only admins, clusters, cluster owners, operators, the
Well, when you-
personas, like on that level.
I mean, when you have logging for network policy, then every network policy or namespace can have this logging enabled, right? So then you can.
But the
Mm.
logs go somewhere where only the admins can see them. Because that's actually
well,
an admin
that's-
feature that was added to network policy because there was no admin network policy.
Exactly, and that's why I asked about metering, because that's typically much more available to see counters. I mean, allowed connection, what you call them, or blocked connections and so on.
We
Can
had
you
talked at
clarify
one point about like possibly having some way that you can figure out conclusively, yes, my packet is being dropped by an admin network policy. You wouldn't be able to figure out what the policy said or why it was dropping, but like, you know, we could theoretically add that functionality somewhere. And then at that point, you know, talk to your admin.
Dan, I had a
Yep.
quick question about something you said. You said logging is an admin persona thing. Is this something that we've like defined somewhere, or is this something you're proposing?
So, well, I mean, specifically, you know, Nadia was, I think, mentioning about because there's no standard logging for network policy, right?
Right.
But the thing we added in OV and Kubernetes, we added that because administrators wanted it, not because, you know, end users wanted it. So the way that it logs, the logs go, you know, into some node level thing that only the admins would have access to. So even though you can enable it on a namespace basis, it's not something that is usable by namespace admins. It's only usable by cluster admins.
I see. So this is like this is an OVN in particular.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
But also before, when you only had namespace network policies, you at least can list all of them and see which network policies exist, so that you, as a namespace owner, you can like at least imagine what can be dropping your packets. And with admin network policy, you may not know that at all.
Right, but for instance, if the cluster administrator creates firewall rules with IP tables, or creates egress firewall rules in OpenShift, you have no way of finding out about that either.
Yeah, sure. That's how it's implemented.
Exactly, and the firewall might not even exist in the cluster. I assume it almost always will, but doesn't have to for anything that goes out, right?
Yeah, and I had a question for Rahul. So you mentioned in GKE, you use either CRD for enabling it on a full cluster-wide level, or on namespaces using annotation. And that namespaces using annotation is what we do on OVNK also, like Dan said, though we don't really have a way to do it on a cluster-wide level. But what about ANP? Do you have support for admin policies downstream there, or?
Unfortunately, no, we don't have any ANP support on GKE right now.
Okay. Yeah, like for example, the annotation thing on a namespace, that seems like a common thing that everyone is doing. So maybe that is one thing standardizable, but again, for ANP, it might not be on a namespace level, but it has to be on a policy level. I don't know.
It may be difficult to decide how like this logging as a part of API should look like, because it probably may provide different options of what, like if you only provide enable disable logging, or if you allow log levels, where maybe there are some more options for specific implementations.
Yeah.
Yeah, that may be difficult to standardize that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a valid point, that it does depend on each implementation and exactly how they convert the ingress and egress rules in their implementation and how the logging makes sense for them. So maybe it is hard to standardize, but yeah, just wanted to bring that up to see, if there are ideas doing this upstream, or if we, at least in OVNK, should take care of this downstream again. All right, sounds good. I think that was a good discussion. Anyone wants to add something to the logging topic before we move on to Nadia's item? Okay, and Nadia, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's just a continuation of that conversation about what's the best way to express tenancy in the most simple way that covers all of our cases. I have added one more option there, which adds a completely separate object for that. I think it would be nice to hear some feedback on that in general. If I just summarize that, there are some fields. So when we talk about tenancy, it seems like our use cases only need to define tenant to tenant relationship. So basically the only type of peer that we may have at this point is same or not same tenant. And like there are no other ways to say anything that would make sense. And then, so based on some of the previous versions of SRD that Dan added, it also has a namespace selector that basically defines which namespaces are considered or like a subject for this tenancy. And then same labels field just says how these namespaces are split into tenants based on which labels. And that also solves one of the problems we discussed about what we want to do for empty labels, right? So if you don't want to consider label, let's say user that doesn't exist, if you don't want this namespace to be a part of a tenant, you just add this exists selector that will avoid that. And then in case you do not add it, there will be a separate tenant that has empty user label. So I guess in general that like simplifies again some of the problems we've already discussed. There are two like corner cases on this. One thing is that if that's a separate object, it needs to be probably in the same priority range as admin network policy, which is kind of the same as it was before, but from the semantics point of view, but it will mean that we have two different objects that operate on the same priority range. And then another question was if we need to, in case we end up with this object, do we need to have baseline admin network policy tenancy thing, which will be applied after network policy? And I think existing BNP API allows tenancy, but then I thought about that a bit more and I couldn't find a use case where you would like to imply tenancy on BNP level because it may be overridden with network policies, so doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah, so that's a recap of what this change was about.
Oh, yeah. I was gonna say, I think there is one use case which, maybe it didn't get written down, but I know it's something we talked about, which is the admin denying all egress by default in a baseline admin network policy. And then, well, although I guess maybe that's not really a tenant thing, though. That's just a baseline admin network policy thing. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, I guess if you want to have soft tenancy, right? So the admin creates a rule saying, no communication between tenants by default.
Yeah,
but-
I actually thought about that, and I tried to think again about what every object means in general, right? So when we talk about admin network policy, that's something you enforce as an admin, unless you use some proto namespace labels, but we can't talk about that, or some labels you do not control. And then network policy is like the developer's desire to secure their namespaces. And then when you fall down to baseline admin network policy, that's just the default network policy object for namespace, basically, because it is completely overridable. So I'm not sure if there is any other use case for baseline admin network policy, except for it to be the default network policy in case you don't provide anyone one, or in case you want to just add some more rules to this default network policy.
Can I ask a more high-level question? And I apologize, this is probably treading old ground because I've missed a couple of these meetings. But is there a TLDR on what the goal would be for this new tenancy construct? Like however it ends up shaking out, is it because we want to express something we can't in ANP today, or we think we can express it more simply?
Yeah, it's more of a second option, and there were some slides that they when I tried to explain why the existing API may be a bit confusing, or maybe allow more options that we actually need. So that in general, this is an effort to simplify the existing API.
Okay.
This started when Nadia was starting to implement this, and it was like, why can you do this? And, why does this work this way? And so there were a bunch of conversations about it that led to the realization that we added tenancy to admin network policy in a way that is much, much, much more flexible than you actually need for the user stories we have. And so we thought, maybe we should rein it in before people start doing totally insane things and you're forced to make your implementation really like inefficient and, to support all the possibilities.
Okay, any other questions or comments on that? Okay, I think then we can keep this discussion in the doc comments. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. I think we've also attached the document to the agenda. So, and thanks Nadia for linking the presentation here, which we had done a few meetings ago, which kind of outlines the difficulties around same and not same labels, and like Dan mentioned, how we can define it in a way that does not give so much of freedom to express relations. But yeah, let's keep the discussion going around that one and see if we can come to a consensus on how we want to do that, at least for the next version of the API. Yeah, the next major version. And that's really all we have on the agenda. Does anyone want to bring up other topics, discussions, questions, suggestions? Going once, twice, and sold. So thanks everyone for joining the meeting today. Have a great rest of the day. Talk to you all again in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Surya.
Thanks.